the European Commission is pitching what it says is a radical new plan to fight the climate crisis.
Today is the start of a journey. But this is Europe's man on the moon moment.
The Just Transition Mechanism, dubbed the Green Deal, would have EU member states commit billions of dollars to help their industries transition away from the use of fossil fuels. If adopted, the plan mandates spending 40% of the bloc's agricultural budget on tackling climate change. Electricity generation would have to rely completely on renewable sources by 2050. And all forms of transportation would have to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Prominent leaders like the UN Secretary General have thrown in their support for the plan, saying it should encourage other countries to take similar steps.
It is always essential that someone starts. We need to have one green emitter to start. And if Europe will do so, that I think will be a very important contribution for others to consider the same kind of commitment. If no one starts, then there is no chance.
But activists say the EU's plan lacks urgency and that the targets and timeline it sets out are inadequate to address the issue.
The heads of government and state are discussing today whether the European Union should go climate neutral by 2050. That is an important target, but it is not good enough to leave it to future generations to take actions. Our heads of state and government must take action today.
The inaction from other large polluters like the US is also a challenge. Last week, the Trump administration began its withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, a process that will conclude by this time next year.
The European Union has the opportunity to provide outstanding leadership in the world during this period when Donald Trump is trying to move the U.S. in the wrong direction. I'm hopeful that a Green New Deal will be adopted in the U.S. I'm hopeful that we'll have a new president as well in the election less than 1 year from today.
There are also fears over European governments possibly failing to meet their commitments even if they sign the Green Deal. On Thursday, the European Central Bank's new president, Christine Lagarde, kept interest rates unchanged at the historic low of minus 0.5%, saying economic growth is still weak. Climate activists fear that could drive some governments to divert funds away from the climate initiative. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Well, let's get more on this now with Karel Lannoo, the CEO of the Centre for European Policy Studies in Brussels. Welcome back to Money Talks, Karel. Now, a carbon-neutral European Union by the year 2050, barely 30 years away. Is Ursula von der Leyen being too ambitious here?
250 is still a very long time ahead of us. That's more than 30 years. But if we want to do this, we have to start now. Means, let's say, that we have to plan our investments now, for example, for energy, for infrastructure, for also transport, to start them now to be ready in 30 years. But if you see how we have already evolved over the last 20 years, I mean, there is a lot which has already happened. Think about wind energy, renewables, solar panels, but there is much more we can be done. But we now have a clear plan in place in the different areas, and we want to move in this direction. And on top of that, there is a strong support from users, from consumers, from citizens all over Europe to move in this direction.
Now, we know the EU has a very diverse membership. Some economies are more advanced than others. Some countries, in terms of their climate change planning, are more advanced than the others as well. Is it the case that perhaps those nations who aren't as developed in their climate crisis strategies might get left behind?
But we have an EU as an EU which will have the funds at EU level and which will have the funds to support also member states which are less advanced. But we also have to know that, I mean, the carbon emissions do not only depend on the level of development, I mean, of kind of a certain economy. Carbon emissions may be much higher in a very developed economy than they are in another. So we can probably correct at an earlier stage with less developed economies to prevent what we have probably in certain more developed economies. So there is certainly a big opportunity here. And as you may know, we will use the European Investment Bank's borrowing capacity to help all kinds of actors to reach the target.
Okay, now EU members that rely heavily on fossil fuels, such as Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, they've all expressed some concerns that perhaps their economies might be the hardest hit under this so-called Green Deal. What does this plan do to allay those fears?
I mean, it just set some central targets. I mean, there is a lot which has to be filled in by the member states themselves. But again, as I said, let's say there will be certainly financial support for these countries to help to fill that in. But sometimes, which is often forgotten, is that there is a huge cost in certain countries, like the ones which I mentioned, which are still relying a lot on fossil fuels in terms of, for example, cost for healthcare, cost in the pollution it causes. So these things will certainly be tackled and will put these countries on a faster way to get there in time for 2050.
Okay, and as we know, EU members are currently discussing this Green Deal. We'll see how those discussions go. Karel Lannoo in Brussels, thank you so much for your analysis.